Welcome to the third and final section of Chapter 4 on quantitative methods. Now we're going to talk about study design. When you're doing quantitative research, there's at least three different categories you could sort these into. The first are true experiments, which involve random assignment. You take the people who've signed up and agreed to participate, and you randomly assign them to, say, a control group that you don't do an intervention with. You just have them fill out some measures, right? Some where they're going to be studied for certain variables, or an experimental group where they get put into a group randomly where they undergo first some training and then have them fill out those measures, or they get exposed to some kind of communication material, social media, or maybe say violent pornography, which is problematic, but you know what I mean. Exposure to playing video games, right, and then asking them to fill out the kind of measures. So that's a true experiment. They also do research with quasi experiments, meaning we take naturally existing groups and subject them, like sort of like with the before and after. You give them a pre-test and a post-test, and you say, okay, before I taught you more about supportive communication in the workplace, this is how you were measured. But after I taught this real team that really exists in a real corporation, after I taught them about supportive communication in the workplace, this is how they scored on these tests. So it is a quasi-experimental. You wasn't random, but you used the one that existed. But you did really see whether something changed in a pre and post test format. Lastly, there are non-experiments. There's no manipulation. It usually just means you give somebody a survey to test them on where they're at. You don't teach them anything or subject them to anything or ask them to do something and then measure things. You just do a measurement. Or sometimes you're doing observations where you actually measure the number of times people do something while being recorded, right? So it is not experimental. You're just noting behaviors that you've previously defined. So data collection methods in quantitative research include surveys, right, where you ask them yes or no questions or just check off a box for certain kinds of identities or characteristics that they have. But they also involve something called Likert scales, which is any time that you are asked, please rate how much this describes you on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 or 1 to 10 or 1 to 3, right? Or doesn't describe me at all to describes me a lot with something in the middle around kind of or sometimes. Right. So those are surveys and Likert scales. Observation, right? We often code certain kinds of behavior. People do what's called interaction analysis or conversational analysis, where you record people having conversations and then you code for certain kinds of verbal and nonverbal communication with other people. And it's called coding. You code for those kinds of behaviors. Sometimes you observe in the wild, like I do, but if you do that, you don't tend to count things. You're doing much more ritually descriptive things. By wild, I mean an actually existing healthcare center or workplace or school or whatever. Okay, last thing, you can look at existing artifacts, meaning you go and count things or measure things that are in archival medical records, or that are in, you do a content analysis of streaming media and count the number of characters of color or count the number of characters of women. The Gina Davis Institute does this, for example, looking at how many women end up in leading roles versus sidekick roles, or how many people of color are in leading roles versus sidekick roles. Spoiler alert, it's usually men in leading roles, it's usually women in more supporting, but it's also usually white people, including white women, in leading roles, and people of color more in secondary roles or non-speaking roles. That has changed a lot. It hasn't changed enough. There are very few people with physical disabilities, for example, featured in any kind of streaming or broadcast media, just as one example. But anyway, you can do those kind of content analyses. How you do samples, right? We do samples because trying to study all the people or all the women or all the people of color or all the Republicans isn't possible. So you do a sample. There's a thing called probability sampling, right? Meaning that you look at trying to get random samples or what's called systematic or stratified samples. Don't worry too much about that. It just means you're trying to make sure that you have used randomness to make sure you don't have a bias towards picking one particular type of subgroup of people so that it's representative of the group. However, there's also a lot of non-probability sampling, meaning you just aren't able to reach out to a large sample of all the college students in the world. You're just going to look at the ones at Santa Clara. right? And that's not a probability sampling. It's what's called a convenience sample, right? When you just give it to all the students at Santa Clara or all the student athletes at Santa Clara or all that kind of thing, right? All the students with disabilities at Santa Clara, that kind of thing. Snowball, though, is another approach, and this means that you look for people who, like, maybe you're interested in queer students with disabilities. That's a narrower group, right? Or people of color who are registered Republicans, also a much narrower group. So you might use a snowballing technique to try to find them, meaning you find the ones you know from your personal network by asking friends to recommend people. And then when you contact them, if they agree to participate, you also ask them if they know other people who would fall into their group. I do this when I'm studying people with chronic illness or who are long-term survivors of cancer, right? Because they're not like, there's no one place to go to find these kind of people. Lastly, when we're measuring people, we have to understand that there is a margin of error, right? Meaning we try to be precise, but there's also going to be differences in our samples, particularly when they're not random samples and the population we're trying to claim that this generalizes to. And doesn't mean you can't do it. All research has some limitations and constraints, right? Even if you can't get everybody, getting somebody is still useful. You just have to be careful how you talk about it. Secondly, statistical significance. This is, i.e., the rules of statistics that say, okay, this went well enough and the effect that you found is big enough that we don't think it was just random chance that you got these results. We think these results are meaningful, that they really do say something. And we're not going to get super deep into in this class on how you measure that, but you will learn about that when you take quantitative methods class.